Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The Kennecott copper mine in Alaska was hiring safety inspectors at double the usual rate, and nobody in town would tell me why. I'd just turned 26 that October of 2008, barely scraping by after mining school left me buried in debt, and my engineering degree wasn't worth much with the economy in free fall. The recruiter, Vernon, had this glass eye that wandered while his good one stayed locked on you, and he kept mentioning how remote the location was, repeating it like a warning dressed up as small talk. He pushed a contract across the desk with his fingertips, never quite touching the paper for more than a second, and told me I'd need to stay minimum 6 months. No exceptions, no matter what I heard or saw. The pay was enough to clear my loans and then some, enough to finally move out of my parents' basement, where I'd been camping out since graduation. Vernon's good eye twitched when I signed, and he muttered something about hoping I was different from the others. The mining town clung to the mountainside like something that didn't want to be there. All rust-stained buildings and crooked walkways that creaked under your weight. My first morning, I watched the work crews heading into the tunnels and noticed how they moved in tight formations, shoulders almost touching, nobody walking more than an arm's length from the next man. Craig, my assigned roommate, was this thick-armed drill operator who obsessively organized baseball cards by year and player stats, creating these elaborate spreadsheets that covered our kitchen table. He chewed tobacco constantly, spitting into old soup cans he lined up on the windowsill. And he had this habit of counting the miners as they entered the tunnels each morning, then counting again when they came out for lunch, and again at shift end. When I asked about the counting, he just said management didn't always keep accurate records, and somebody had to make sure everyone who went in came back out. On my third day, they assigned me to inspect Tunnel 7 with 2 veteran miners, Frank and Eduardo. Frank had been there 11 years, which apparently made him something of a miracle according to the others, and he had this peculiar way of tapping the tunnel walls every few feet with a ball-peen hammer he carried everywhere. Not for structural integrity, he explained, but to let anyone or anything in the deeper shafts know we were coming through. Eduardo, younger but still weathered from 5 years underground, kept adjusting the brightness on his headlamp obsessively, clicking it high to low to high again in patterns that seemed deliberate. They wouldn't let me walk between them, insisting I stay at the back where they could both see me. And every time we passed one of the older tunnel entrances that had been sealed with concrete, they'd go completely silent until we were at least 50 feet past it. The sealed tunnels were everywhere once you got deep enough into the mountain, these concrete slabs with dates stenciled on them going back to the 1960s. Some had official hazard signs, but others just had numbers and initials, no explanation for why they'd been closed off. I found a logbook in the safety office from 1987 that mentioned structural instabilities in sections that were nowhere near fault lines or weak rock formations. The pages for September through November of that year had been torn out, leaving just the ragged edges in the binding. When I brought it to my supervisor, a sweaty man named Briggs, who always wore the same flannel shirt, he took the book and said he'd look into it. I never saw that logbook again, but I started keeping my own notes in a personal journal I hid inside my mattress lining. The thing that really set everything in motion happened on a Wednesday morning, when the temperature dropped to -15. I was reviewing equipment manifests in the office when Craig burst through the door, his face the color of old newspaper, tobacco juice dribbling down his chin forgotten. He grabbed my shoulders hard enough to leave bruises and kept repeating that Tommy Fitzgerald's crew hadn't come up. They'd gone into Tunnel 4 at 6 that morning for routine copper vein assessment, just 3 guys with standard gear, and it was now past noon. The elevator operator, an old Vietnamese guy named Duck who wore his wife's rosary around his neck, swore he never brought them back up. But here's what made my skin prickle. Their names had been crossed off the morning roster like they'd already completed their shift, and the handwriting looked exactly like Tommy's, down to the way he curved his T's. We organized a search party immediately, though I noticed how the veteran miners kept finding excuses to delay. Someone's equipment wasn't working right. Another needed to file paperwork first. A third suddenly remembered an urgent medical appointment. Finally, it was just me, Craig, Frank, and 2 younger guys named Bradley and Kevin, who'd only been there 3 months. The elevator ride down felt like descending into a throat, the cables groaning in ways I'd never heard before. When we reached Tunnel 4, we found Tommy's crew's equipment scattered near the entrance. Their helmets arranged in a perfect triangle on the ground, headlamps still on and burning, pointing inward at each other. Their tools were there too, but twisted into shapes that made no sense. Drill bits bent into spirals, pickaxes with handles wrapped around their own heads like metal snakes. Frank grabbed my arm before I could touch anything, his fingers digging in hard enough that I felt it through my jacket. He pointed at the ground where I was about to step. There were scratches in the rock, deep gouges that formed words. "They make us dig ourselves out." The letters were jagged, desperate, carved by fingernails judging by the blood dried in the grooves. Bradley started hyperventilating, that gasping wheeze echoing off the tunnel walls, while Kevin backed toward the elevator saying he needed to report this to management immediately. But Craig blocked his path, explaining in this deadly calm voice that management already knew, had always known, and reporting it would just make us the next crew that didn't come back up. That's when we heard it, a rhythmic scraping from deeper in the tunnel, metal on stone, keeping perfect time like a metronome. The sound pulled at something primitive in my brain, every instinct screaming to run, but Frank was already moving toward it with that hammer of his raised. We followed because the alternative was splitting up, and even the 3-month rookies knew that was a death sentence in these tunnels. About 200 feet in, the main shaft opened into a cavity that wasn't on any map I'd studied. The walls were too smooth, too perfectly circular, like something had bored through the rock with incredible heat. And there, in the center, we found Tommy Fitzgerald. He was alone, standing with his back to us, making that scraping sound with what was left of a shovel. His clothes were shredded, hanging in strips, and his skin underneath was covered in what looked like chemical burns, these perfect circles the size of quarters all over his arms and neck. When Frank called his name, Tommy turned around and his eyes were gone. Not gouged out, but filled with this milky substance that had hardened like concrete. Tommy's mouth opened and closed like he was trying to speak, but only this wet clicking came out, like bones breaking underwater. He kept scraping that shovel against the wall in the same pattern, and I realized he was writing something, the same 5 numbers over and over, 31, 7, 85, 2, 19. Craig recognized it first, went pale as winter ash, and whispered that those were employee ID numbers of miners who'd disappeared back in 1994. Tommy's hands never stopped moving, even though the flesh was worn down to visible bone on his fingers. The shovel handle fused to his palms somehow, melted into the skin like plastic. Behind him, further in that impossible cavity, we could see the others from his crew, or what was left of them. They were partially embedded in the walls, their bodies twisted at angles that broke every law of anatomy, faces pressed into the rock but still breathing, their chests rising and falling in unison. Bradley lost it completely, started screaming about how this wasn't possible, how none of this could be real, and that's when the light started failing. Not all at once, but in sequence, like something was moving toward us from the deeper parts of the tunnel, extinguishing each light source as it approached. Frank shoved us all back toward the main shaft, practically carrying Bradley, who'd gone limp with terror. But Tommy followed us, still scraping that shovel, leaving a trail of blood and something else, this clear, viscous fluid that smelled like hot copper and antiseptic. Kevin slipped in it, went down hard, and when Craig pulled him up, we saw that the fluid had eaten through his pants, leaving these same perfect circular burns on his legs. The elevator was still there, thank God, but Duke was gone, just his rosary lying on the control panel. The beads partially melted into the metal. Frank knew how to operate the elevator from his years there, his hands steady even while the rest of us were falling apart. As we rose, that scraping sound followed us up the shaft, echoing from below, getting closer even though that should have been impossible with how fast we were ascending. The elevator suddenly lurched to a stop between levels, cables groaning like they were being pulled from below. Through the cage floor, we could see Tommy climbing up the shaft walls, his broken fingers somehow finding purchase on the smooth metal, that shovel still fused to one hand, and carving grooves as he climbed. The emergency phone in the elevator was dead, just this thick static that sounded almost like breathing. Craig started kicking at the emergency hatch, managed to get it open, and we climbed out onto the top of the elevator cage, then up the emergency ladder bolted to the shaft wall. My arms burned, muscles screaming. But the alternative was whatever Tommy had become reaching us. We made it to the surface just as the sun was setting, bursting out of the auxiliary exit like we were being born again. But the camp was empty, completely, utterly empty. Every building door stood open, papers blowing in the wind, vehicles still running with doors ajar. In the main office, we found the staff roster, and every single name had been crossed out in that same handwriting, including ours, with times of death listed as 14:33, 20 minutes before we'd even gone down to search. Craig grabbed the satellite phone to call for evacuation, but the only response was a recorded message from corporate saying the Kennecott facility had been permanently closed due to a catastrophic equipment failure, dated 3 days ago. We took the only working truck and drove 14 hours straight to Anchorage, nobody saying a word the entire time, afraid that acknowledging what happened would somehow make it follow us. The moment we reached Anchorage, Frank drove straight to the state police station. But when we tried to file a report, the officer pulled up the Kennecott mine on his computer and showed us a news article from a week earlier. According to the article, the mine had been closed for renovation since August. No workers on site, completely shut down for safety upgrades. Our names weren't in any employee database. Our contracts didn't exist, and when Craig called his wife from the station phone, she said he'd been home all week recovering from the flu. But we still had Kevin's legs covered in those circular burns. We still had my journal with dates and entries, and we still had the dirt under our fingernails from climbing that shaft. The officer took one look at Kevin's wounds, made a phone call, and within an hour, men in suits arrived. Not FBI or police, but something else, no badges, just clipboards and medical equipment. They separated us for questioning, kept us in different rooms for 18 hours, asking the same questions about gas leaks and hallucinations, and whether we'd been exposed to any chemicals. Eventually, they had us sign papers, non-disclosure agreements, medical waivers, documents admitting we'd trespassed on private property and suffered from group psychosis brought on by carbon monoxide exposure. The alternative, they made clear without saying it directly, was disappearing like Tommy's crew. We took the settlement money, enough to keep us quiet and comfortable, and we scattered. Craig moved to Florida. Frank went to Montana. Bradley checked himself into psychiatric care, and Kevin just vanished one day, left everything behind. I ended up in Oregon, working construction, trying to pretend those 3 weeks at Kennecott never happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that rhythmic scraping sound in my walls, and I find myself checking my arms for circular burns that haven't appeared yet. I know the others hear it too because we have a group text, no words, just a check-in every Sunday at 14:33. So far, everyone still responds. So far. The storage room in our forensic lab basement has always given everyone the creeps, but last Saturday, I finally understood why. I'm 28, been working as a forensic anthropology grad student here in Juneau for about 6 months now, cataloging unidentified remains for the state medical examiner's office. Most days it's just measuring bones, entering data into spreadsheets, comparing dental records to missing persons reports that go back decades. The pay covers my rent in this cramped apartment complex downtown, gives me material for my dissertation, and usually doesn't involve anything more disturbing than skeletal fragments and faded paperwork. But that morning, I'd volunteered to organize the pre-1950 case files that had been shoved into corners and forgotten since a flood damaged half our archives in the 70s. Nobody wanted to deal with the water-stained pages and illegible handwriting, so the boxes just sat there, growing mold and collecting dust. Armed with latex gloves, a surgical mask, and enough coffee to fuel a small aircraft, I descended into that narrow, mildew-scented room where the overhead fluorescents buzz and flicker like dying insects. The plan was simple: photograph what I could salvage, transcribe the readable portions, and toss anything too damaged to preserve. Around noon, while moving a rusted filing cabinet to reach boxes wedged behind it, I discovered a manila folder that had fallen between the cabinet and the wall, probably decades ago. The cover had mouse droppings and a thick layer of dust, but I could still make out the faded ink label, M. Thill, 1930, unresolved. Inside were brittle photographs, typed witness statements on yellowing paper, and something that made me set down my coffee with trembling fingers: a hand-drawn map of hiking trails near Juneau, covered in X marks, each annotated with dates ranging from 1930 to 1978, and initials that didn't match any investigator I'd ever heard of in our department. The photographs showed a young woman with dark hair pinned in that distinct 1920s wave style, wearing a wool hiking skirt and boots, smiling at the camera with this genuine warmth that made her seem alive even through the aged paper. Mary Thill, according to the case notes, 22 years old, elementary school teacher, disappeared during a solo hike on a trail that locals still use today. The official report described how searchers found her belongings folded with almost obsessive precision beside the trail, her jacket arranged in a perfect square, her boots placed parallel with the laces tucked inside, her rucksack emptied, and its contents organized by size. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, just her things, arranged like some kind of meticulous display, and Mary herself vanished into the Alaskan wilderness. The investigating officer, a Lieutenant James Brennan, noted that the scene looked staged with deliberate care, and mentioned interviewing a trapper named Silas Holbrook, who claimed to have seen Mary talking to someone near the trailhead, though he couldn't describe the person beyond saying they wore city clothes. But it was the map that really got under my skin, because those X marks weren't random. They formed a pattern along specific elevations, all between 800 and 1,200 feet, all within a 3-mile radius of where Mary's belongings were found. Next to each X were initials and dates: EP 1933, LM 1941, DK 1955, and so on, the most recent being AJ 1978. I cross-referenced those dates with our missing persons database on my laptop, my fingers getting clumsy as I typed, and found something that made the basement suddenly feel 10 degrees colder. Every single date corresponded to a missing hiker in the Juneau area. Not just any hikers, but specifically women between the ages of 20 and 30, all described as hiking alone, all whose belongings were found neatly arranged, but whose bodies never surfaced. 48 years of disappearances, documented on a map hidden in Mary Thill's file, drawn by someone who knew about these cases before some of them were even reported to the police. I should have taken the file straight to my supervisor, should have logged it as evidence and let the proper channels handle it. But something made me dig deeper into that box behind the filing cabinet. Underneath layers of water-damaged reports, I found a leather journal, the kind with a strap closure that had rotted away years ago. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with neat handwriting and fountain pen ink. The first entry was dated May 1930, signed by Silas Holbrook, the same trapper who'd been interviewed about Mary Thill. My mouth went dry as I read his entries, each one describing in clinical detail his observations of female hikers on the trails, their routines, their habits, which ones hiked alone, what time they typically started, where they rested. He wrote about Mary Thill for 3 weeks before her disappearance, noting that she hiked every Sunday after church, always took the same trail, always stopped at the same spot to eat lunch, a clearing with a view of the valley, approximately 1,000 feet elevation. The journal entries continued for decades. the handwriting changing slightly as Holbrook aged, but the obsessive documentation never stopped. He described his collection process in euphemistic terms that made bile rise in my throat. How he would preserve certain hikers who met his criteria, how he would arrange their belongings as a memorial to their beauty, how he would take them to his private sanctuary in the mountains. In 1978, the entries abruptly stopped mid-sentence. The pen apparently dropped while still writing. I flipped through the remaining blank pages and found a folded piece of newspaper tucked into the back cover, an obituary for Silas Holbrook, dated September 1978, describing him as a respected outdoorsman and guide who died of a heart attack at age 73, survived by his grandson Michael Holbrook, who had recently returned to Juneau after college to take over his grandfather's guide business. My laptop screen had gone dark from inactivity, and in the black reflection, I saw movement behind me. I spun around so fast I knocked over my thermos, coffee spreading across the concrete floor, but the doorway was empty. The fluorescent light above me flickered and hummed, casting shifting shadows in the corners of the room. I grabbed my phone to check the time, 3:47 p.m., and noticed I had no signal down in the basement, which wasn't unusual, but suddenly felt threatening. I started photographing the journal pages with shaking hands, the camera flash illuminating the cramped space in harsh bursts. Each flash seemed to make the shadows jump and dance, and I kept hearing sounds from the hallway, footsteps maybe, or just the old building settling. I told myself I was being paranoid, that reading about a serial killer's diary would make anyone jumpy. But then I heard the distinct sound of the stairwell door opening one floor above me. The footsteps were deliberate and measured, work boots on concrete descending toward the basement. We didn't have weekend security, and I hadn't seen any other cars in the parking lot when I'd arrived that morning. The steps paused at the basement door, and I heard the handle turn slowly, metal grinding against metal. I shoved the journal and map into my backpack, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The door opened, and a man stepped into the hallway. Tall, probably mid-50s, wearing a Forest Service uniform that looked authentic but somehow wrong, like it had been kept in storage for too long. He had pale gray eyes and the kind of weathered face you see on people who spend their lives outdoors. When he smiled, it was the practiced smile of someone who'd learned to mimic human warmth without feeling it. "You must be the new researcher," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "I'm Michael Holbrook. My company maintains the trails around here, and we work closely with the medical examiner's office on recovery operations. I heard someone was finally going through the old files." He walked into the storage room without invitation, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor even though it hadn't been raining. The smell hit me then, pine sap and something underneath it, something chemical and sharp like formaldehyde. He stood between me and the door, scanning the boxes and files I'd been sorting, his eyes lingering on the empty space behind the filing cabinet where I'd found the journal. "Found anything interesting?" he asked, moving closer, and I could see dirt under his fingernails, the kind that gets embedded so deep it becomes part of the skin. I managed to stammer something about water damage and illegible records, my backpack feeling impossibly heavy on my shoulder. He reached past me to pick up one of the photographs from Mary Thill's file that I'd left on the table, holding it with a reverence that made my stomach turn. "My grandfather knew her," he said quietly. "Told me stories about all the hikers from back then. Said the mountain takes who it wants, and we shouldn't question its choices." I tried to edge toward the door, but he shifted his weight subtly, still blocking the path. "The thing about these old cases," he continued, setting down the photograph with deliberate care, "is that people today don't understand how different things were back then. No GPS, no cell phones, no emergency beacons. A person could vanish and it wouldn't be anybody's fault, just nature taking its course." His fingers traced the edge of the table, leaving a faint streak of dirt. "My grandfather taught me everything about these trails. Every hidden path, every cave, every place where the earth opens up and swallows what it's given. He had his special spots, places he'd take people who really wanted to understand the wilderness." The way he emphasized special spots made my skin prickle with goosebumps. He passed that knowledge to me before he died. Family legacy, you could say. Michael pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. Him standing with a group of young women in hiking gear, all smiling at the camera, dated just last month. I run guided tours now, very popular with tourists, especially solo female travelers looking for an authentic Alaskan experience. The storage room felt smaller, with each passing second, the walls pressing in, the fluorescent light casting his shadow across the doorway like a physical barrier. I forced myself to look at the photo on his phone, memorizing the faces of those women, wondering if they all made it home safely. "That's nice," I managed to say, my voice cracking. I should probably get going, though. Lost track of time down here. I started gathering random papers, shoving them into a box, trying to look busy and normal, while every instinct screamed at me to run. Michael didn't move. "You know what's funny?" he said, pulling out a worn leather wallet from his pocket. "My grandfather kept detailed records too. Guest logs, trail reports, that sort of thing. Very thorough man." He opened the wallet and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He even kept a list of researchers who showed too much interest in certain cases. Updated it right until the day he died. He unfolded the paper slowly, and I caught a glimpse of names written in that same fountain pen ink I'd seen in the journal. Before he could say anything else, we heard voices from upstairs, multiple people laughing and talking loudly. The weekend cleaning crew, I realized with overwhelming relief, their cartwheels squeaking as they rolled down the hallway above us. Michael's expression shifted, the mask of friendliness cracking for just a moment to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. He folded the paper and put it back in his wallet, then stepped aside from the doorway. "Looks like you have company," he said, his tone light but his eyes never leaving mine. "I should let you get back to work, but hey, if you ever want to see those trails Mary Thill hiked, I'd be happy to show you. I know exactly where they found her things. My grandfather showed me the spot when I was 12, said it was important to remember." He reached into his pocket and placed a business card on the table, his muddy fingers leaving a smear across the white cardstock. "Think about it. Some places in Alaska, you really need a guide who knows the family history." He walked out then, his footsteps echoing up the stairs, and I stood there clutching my backpack, the journal and map pressed against my ribs through the fabric. I waited until I heard the cleaning crew directly outside the basement door before I bolted up the stairs, nodding at them as casually as I could manage while my legs shook beneath me. In the parking lot, Michael's truck was gone, but fresh tire tracks in the mud showed he'd circled the building twice before leaving. I drove straight to the Juneau Police Department, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, checking my mirrors constantly for any sign of that truck. The detective on duty, a woman named Grace Navarro, listened to my story with increasing concern, especially when I showed her the photos I'd taken of the journal. Within an hour, they had a team at the storage facility collecting everything from that basement room. Grace told me they'd been investigating a series of missing hikers from the past 5 years. All women, all solo travelers who'd taken guided tours before disappearing on subsequent solo hikes. The guide company's name on the permits? Holbrook Wilderness Adventures. They'd never had enough evidence to get a warrant, but the journal changed everything. They arrested Michael Holbrook 3 days later at his cabin 40 miles outside Juneau, a place accessible only by helicopter or a hidden trail his grandfather had carved through the mountains in the 1940s. The search team found personal items from 17 women in an underground storage space beneath the cabin. Jewelry, driver's licenses, hiking boots, all meticulously cataloged with dates and initials matching missing persons reports going back to 1979, the year after Silas died. They also found human remains preserved in industrial freezers, though I was told those details would be kept from the public during the trial. Michael had continued his grandfather's work for 46 years, selecting victims from his tours, studying their habits, then intercepting them on solo hikes months later when no one would connect him to their disappearances. The prosecutors said the journal was the key evidence that broke the case. Without it, they might never have understood the full scope of what the Holbrooks had done. As for Mary Thill and the others from Silas's era, Search teams are still combing those mountain trails, using ground-penetrating radar around the elevations marked on that map. They found 4 burial sites so far, and they keep searching. I finished my work in Juneau and moved back to Washington last month, but I still wake up sometimes thinking about Michael's gray eyes and that practiced smile, wondering how many people saw it and trusted him right before they vanished into his grandfather's special places. The fall of '71 found me working for a small logging outfit about 40 miles outside of Haines, up where the spruce gets so thick you can barely see 10 feet ahead. I was 32 then, had been running chainsaws since I was 16, and thought I'd seen everything those woods had to offer. My crew consisted of just 4 guys. Myself, old Walter who'd been cutting timber since before I was born, a kid named Danny fresh out of high school, and our foreman Steve, who mostly handled the equipment and paperwork. We'd set up camp at the mouth of this valley the locals called Silent Valley, though none of us paid much attention to the name at first. The job was supposed to be straightforward: clear about 20 acres of mature spruce for a new access road the state wanted to put through. Good money, decent weather for September, and we figured we'd be done in 3 weeks tops. The first few days went smooth as butter. Nothing out of the ordinary except maybe how quiet it was up there. Now I'd worked plenty of remote sites, but this valley had a peculiar quality to it, the kind of quiet that makes you notice your own breathing. Walter mentioned it on day 3, said in all his years he'd never heard a forest so empty of bird calls, so absent of the usual rustling and chittering you get from squirrels and such. But we had a job to do, and quiet woods meant less distraction, so we kept at it. Our routine was simple: up at 5, breakfast over the camp stove, then into the valley by 6 to start cutting. We'd work until about 4 in the afternoon, then head back to camp for dinner and cards. The company had given us a 2-way radio for emergencies, but the mountains blocked most signals, so we were pretty much on our own out there. It was on the 5th night that I first heard them, the voices. I'd turned in early, around 9, worn out from wrestling with a particularly stubborn old-growth spruce that had taken half the day to bring down. The others were still playing poker in Walter's tent, their laughter drifting through the thin canvas walls. I was just starting to drift off when I heard what sounded like someone talking, way off in the valley. Not shouting or calling out, just regular conversation, like 2 people walking and chatting. The weird part was how clear it sounded despite the distance. Every few seconds I'd catch a word or two, though never enough to make out what was being said. I lay there for maybe 20 minutes straining to hear better, trying to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks or maybe sounds carrying from another logging camp. But there weren't any other operations within 15 miles of us, and the wind had been dead still all day. The next morning at breakfast, I asked the others if they'd heard anything strange during the night. Danny just shrugged and shoveled more beans onto his plate, but Walter gave me this long look over his coffee cup. Steve said he thought he'd heard something around midnight when he'd stepped out to take a leak. Sounded like people having a conversation somewhere up the valley. He'd figured maybe some hunters had wandered through, though hunting season wasn't for another month, and we hadn't seen any tracks besides our own. Walter finally spoke up. Said he'd been hearing things for the past 2 nights but hadn't wanted to spook anyone. Voices, he said. Sometimes just one, sometimes several. Always coming from deeper in the valley where we hadn't cut yet. The strangest thing was how they seemed to echo off the mountains in ways that didn't make sense, like the sound was bouncing off walls that weren't there. We tried to joke about it that morning, Danny saying maybe it was Bigfoot having a family reunion. But nobody really laughed. When we headed into the valley for work, we all noticed how our chainsaws seemed louder than usual, like the sound had nothing to compete with. No birds, no insects, not even the usual rustle of small animals fleeing from our approach. Just our saws and the crash of falling timber. Around noon, I was working a section about 100 yards from the others when my saw died, just cut out completely. In the sudden silence, I heard them again, the voices. This time they were clearer, and I could swear they were speaking English, but the words kept slipping away from understanding, like trying to remember a dream right after waking. They seemed to be coming from 3 different directions at once, which made no damn sense given the shape of the valley. I yanked the pull cord, got my saw running again, and worked the rest of the day with my jaw clenched tight. That night, none of us wanted to admit we were spooked, but we all stayed up later than usual, sitting around the fire instead of heading to our tents. Steve had tried the radio earlier, hoping to reach the company office, but all we got was static with these weird pulses in it, almost rhythmic. Walter told us he'd worked this area back in '58 with a different crew, and they'd abandoned a job about 10 miles north after 2 weeks. Wouldn't say why exactly, just that the forest up here could play tricks on you, make you hear things that weren't there, or maybe were there but shouldn't be. He said one of the guys from that crew, a Tlingit fellow named Joseph, had told him the old-timers avoided these valleys, said the mountains held sounds from long ago, conversations from people who'd passed through decades or even centuries back. I wanted to call bullshit on that, but sitting there with the firelight barely pushing back the dark and those voices still echoing in my memory, I kept my mouth shut. The 7th night changed everything. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of my own name being called, not shouted, not whispered, just spoken plain as day, like someone standing right outside my tent was trying to get my attention. "Tom," it said, then again, "Tom." The voice was familiar but wrong somehow, like hearing a recording of yourself played at the wrong speed. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap, ready to give whoever was messing with me a piece of my mind. But there was nobody there. The beam of my flashlight cut through empty air, showing nothing but the other tents and the dark line of trees beyond our camp. Then I heard it from the opposite direction. My name again. Same voice, same calm tone. I spun around, and that's when I saw Walter standing outside his tent, flashlight in hand, looking just as confused as I felt. "You hear that?" he asked, and before I could answer, we both heard Danny's voice, clear as anything, coming from the valley. Except Danny was in his tent. We could see the shape of him through the canvas sitting up in his sleeping bag. Steve came stumbling out of his tent, asking what the hell was going on, and that's when things got truly weird. We heard Steve's voice too, coming from the tree line, asking the same question he'd just asked, but with this hollow quality to it, like an echo that came before the original sound. We stood there in our underwear and boots, 4 grown men scared stupid, listening to our own voices having conversations we weren't having, coming from places we weren't standing. The worst part was when we heard Walter's voice from deep in the valley say something none of us had said yet. We should leave. Pack up right now and leave. The real Walter just stood there, mouth hanging open, because those were the exact words he'd been about to say. I could see it in his face. We did pack up some of our gear that night, threw it in the truck, ready to bolt at first light. But Danny, trying to be brave or maybe just stupid, convinced us to stay, said we'd never live it down if we ran from some weird echo phenomenon, probably caused by temperature inversions or some scientific thing we didn't understand. The next morning, day 8, Walter was gone. His tent was still zipped from the inside, sleeping bag laid out neat like he'd just stepped out for a minute, but his boots were missing, and so was he. We found his tracks heading into the valley, steady and purposeful, not like someone stumbling around in the dark. We followed them for about a quarter mile before they just stopped, not disappeared gradually or got confused with other tracks. They just ended mid-stride, in a patch of soft earth between 2 massive spruces. Steve tried the radio again, managed to get a crackling connection to report Walter missing, but the static was so bad he wasn't sure if anyone heard him. We spent the whole morning searching, calling Walter's name until our throats were raw, but the only answer we got was our own voices bouncing back from directions that made no geometric sense. Around noon, Danny found Walter's chainsaw about 300 yards from where the tracks ended, sitting upright against a tree like someone had carefully placed it there. The chain was clean, the gas tank full, no sign it had been used that day. We were packing up to leave, screw the job, screw the money, when we heard Walter's chainsaw start up somewhere deeper in the valley. That distinctive Husqvarna growl was unmistakable. Walter had modified the muffler himself to give it a particular sound. We stood there paralyzed because we could see Walter's saw sitting right there in the back of Steve's truck where we'd just put it. But the sound kept going, steady and workmanlike, occasionally revving high like it was biting through wood. Steve grabbed his rifle from the truck and we headed toward the sound, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to run the opposite direction. The sound led us to a grove we hadn't cut yet, and when we got there, we found fresh-cut stumps, sawdust still settling in the air, the smell of pine pitch and bar oil heavy in the air. The cuts were clean, professional, exactly the way Walter would have done them. But there was no one there, and the sound of the chainsaw had stopped the moment we'd entered the grove. That's when Danny noticed that the trees had been cut from the inside out. The stumps were in the center of the grove, but there were no drag marks, no path cleared to get in there. It was like someone had started cutting from the middle of an untouched stand of timber. That was enough for us. We ran back to camp, threw everything in the trucks without even folding the tents properly. Just bundled everything up like our lives depended on getting out of there fast. As we were loading the last of the gear, I heard it one more time. Walter's voice, clear and close like he was standing right behind me. "The valley keeps what it wants," he said, and when I spun around, there was nobody there, just Danny and Steve already in their trucks, engines running, ready to leave. I didn't tell them what I'd heard. We drove out of there doing 40 on a logging road meant for maybe 15 miles per hour, tools bouncing in the truck beds, not caring if we wrecked the suspension. About 5 miles down, we passed a Forest Service truck heading up toward the valley. The ranger flagged us down, asked if we were the crew that had called in about a missing worker. Steve did the talking, told them about Walter, showed them on the map where we'd been camped. The ranger, an older guy with deep lines around his eyes, just nodded like he'd heard this story before. Said they'd send a search team up, but the way he said it, I could tell he didn't expect to find anything. They searched for 2 weeks, found Walter's body on day 12, sitting at the base of a tree about 2 miles from our camp, in an area we'd searched at least 3 times. The coroner said he'd been dead for at least 10 days, which made no sense given when he'd disappeared. No signs of injury, no animal predation, just sitting there with his eyes closed like he'd decided to take a nap and never woke up. His feet were bare and clean, no signs he'd walked 2 miles through the forest. The chainsaw sounds, the voices, the trees cut from inside out, none of that made it into the official report. The authorities blamed it on carbon monoxide from a faulty heater in his tent, said he'd wandered off disoriented and died of exposure. But his tent didn't have a heater, and it hadn't been cold enough for exposure. Steve and Danny never talked about it afterward, and I never went back to logging. I work construction now, nice and safe in town where the only sounds are the ones that make sense. But sometimes, on real quiet nights, I still hear Walter's voice saying those words, and I know that Valley is still up there, still keeping whatever it wants to keep. Last August, I was staying at my uncle's fishing lodge about 60 miles northwest of Fairbanks, Alaska. He'd owned the place since the 70s, this run-down cabin that sits maybe half a mile from where a tributary feeds into the Tanana River. I'd been going there since I was a kid, but that summer I went alone after my divorce finalized, needing somewhere quiet to clear my head. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles away, just how I wanted it. My Uncle Nathan always said the property had good bones but bad history. Some old-timer had sold it to him dirt cheap after his brother disappeared hunting in the 50s. I'd been there 4 days already, mostly just fishing and reading, when I decided to explore a section of the property I'd never really checked out before, this marshy area where the ground stays soft even in dry weather. The morning started normal enough. Coffee at sunrise, eggs and toast, the usual routine when you're living rough. Around 9, I grabbed my hiking pack and headed toward the marsh, thinking maybe I'd find some good spots for duck hunting come fall. The terrain out there is tricky, All these little pools of standing water hidden under moss and grass that looks solid until you step on it. About 40 minutes in, my boot caught on something metal sticking up from the boggy ground. First, I figured it was just old farming equipment. You find that stuff all over Alaska from abandoned homesteads. But when I bent down to free my boot, I saw it was aluminum, not rusted iron like you'd expect from farm tools. The piece was maybe 2 feet long, twisted and partially buried, with what looked like rivet holes along one edge. The metal had this odd greenish patina, not quite corrosion, but something that happens to aircraft aluminum when it's been in acidic soil for decades. I started digging around the piece with my hands, pulling away decades of moss and black mud that smelled like rotting vegetation and motor oil. The metal went deeper than I expected, connected to a larger section that was bent at an unnatural angle, like something had hit with tremendous force. There were numbers stamped into one section, AF, and then some digits I couldn't make out, all corroded, but definitely military designation style. I'd seen enough military surplus to recognize that. My grandfather had been Air Force, stationed at Alaskan back in the early 50s, and he'd shown me old equipment with similar markings. The weird part was finding it here, in the middle of nowhere, on land that had been private property since before World War II, according to the county records my uncle had shown me once. I kept excavating, using a fallen branch as a makeshift shovel, and about 3 feet down I hit something that made me stop breathing for a second. It was leather, preserved by the acidic bog water, still holding its shape after all these years. A boot, military issue by the look of it, the kind with the metal grommets and thick soles they used in the 40s and 50s. The leather had turned almost black, but you could still see the stitching pattern. Inside the boot, pushed deep into the toe area, was something wrapped in what might have been oilcloth once but had mostly deteriorated into a waxy gray material. My fingers were numb from the cold mud, but I managed to peel away the wrapping. Inside was a small field journal, the pages fused together by moisture and time, and a tarnished silver wristwatch that had stopped at 2:17. The smart thing would have been to call the authorities right then, but something made me keep digging. Maybe it was the way that boot had been deliberately placed, not scattered like crashed debris, but positioned carefully, like someone had hidden those items on purpose. Another hour of digging revealed more aluminum fragments, all with that same green patina, and then I found something that made my chest tighten. A leather wallet, the kind with the chain attached, preserved like the boot, but split at the seams. Inside were plasticized cards, military identification mostly destroyed by time, but I could make out part of a name. Sergeant J. Something that started with M. The birth year was partially visible, 192. There was a photograph too, protected by plastic, showing a young woman holding a baby standing in front of a white clapboard house with a peaked roof. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written, Betty and... but the rest was gone. I sat back on my heels, mud up to my elbows, staring at these remnants of someone's life scattered in this bog. The sun had moved past noon, and the shadows were getting longer between the scraggly black spruce trees that bordered the marsh. That's when I noticed something else about the debris pattern. The metal pieces weren't random. They formed a rough line heading northeast, like something had come apart in the air and scattered along a trajectory. Following that line with my eyes, I could see slight depressions in the moss, decades old but still visible if you knew what to look for. I started walking that direction, finding more pieces every 20 or 30 feet. A twisted bracket here, a section of cable there, all that same weathered aluminum with military-grade fittings. About 200 yards from where I'd found the boot, the ground dipped into a natural hollow filled with standing water the color of weak tea. The water in that hollow was maybe knee-deep, and through it I could see the outline of something massive just below the surface. My heart was hammering as I waded in, the cold water flooding my boots instantly. It was part of a fuselage, about 15 feet of it, broken open like an eggshell, but still recognizable as aircraft structure. The metal skin had those distinctive riveted panels you see on old military transports. Inside, Everything organic was long gone, but the aluminum frame members and seat brackets were still there, twisted and compressed from impact. On one intact section of the interior wall, I could make out stenciled letters, "No Step," and below that, partially obscured, USAF, followed by numbers I couldn't read. The cargo area had these heavy-duty tie-down points welded to the floor, way more robust than what you'd need for regular supplies or personnel transport. Whatever this plane had been carrying, it had been heavy and needed serious securing. What really got to me, though, was finding the jacket. It was wool, dark blue, caught on a jagged piece of metal near what would have been the rear of the fuselage section. Air Force issue from that era, with the sergeant stripes still visible on the sleeve. The name tape was there too, faded but readable. Morrison. In the chest pocket, wrapped in a rubber pouch that had somehow stayed watertight, was a folded set of orders. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but I could read the date clearly, January 15th, 1950. The text was mostly standard military language about transport duties, but one line jumped out at me. Classified cargo pursuant to operation, and then a black redaction bar that someone had applied with ink, not printed that way. Below that, coordinates that matched almost exactly where I was standing, except these weren't supposed to be a destination. They were marked as Checkpoint Alpha, with a final destination of Elmendorf Air Force Base. I was so focused on reading those orders that I didn't hear the helicopter until it was almost on top of me. The sound came fast, that distinctive thump, thump, thump echoing off the hills, and when I looked up, a white and blue civilian bell was circling low, maybe 300 feet up. No markings I could see except for a registration number. It made two tight circles, and I could see someone in the passenger seat with what looked like a camera or binoculars pointed right at me. Then just as suddenly as it appeared, it banked hard and headed southeast toward Fairbanks. The whole thing lasted maybe 90 seconds, but every hair on my neck was standing up. In 20 years of coming to this property, I'd never seen aircraft fly that low over this area, except for the occasional bush plane heading to the villages up north, and those never circled like that. I grabbed everything I could carry, the journal, the watch, the wallet, the orders, and stuffed them in my pack, then started back toward the cabin fast. The sun was getting low, maybe 3 hours of light left, and I kept checking the sky every few seconds. My mind was racing through the implications. This crash site had been here for over 70 years, undiscovered on private land, and within hours of me finding it, someone was already surveying the area. By the time I made it back to the cabin, my shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the cool evening air. I locked the door, something I never did out there, and spread the items on the kitchen table. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. The field journal's pages were fused, but the edges had writing and one partial sentence was visible. Cargo is reactive to, and then nothing. The next visible fragment said, men showing symptoms of, and the rest was destroyed by water damage. Around 8 that evening, I heard vehicles coming up the access road, multiple engines, heavy ones. Through the window, I saw 3 black SUVs pull up, no government plates but that unmistakable federal look. 6 people got out, all in outdoor gear like they were just hikers or hunters, but the way they moved was too coordinated, too purposeful. The man who knocked on my door was probably 50, gray hair and a military cut, friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Carlson from the Environmental Protection Agency, said they'd received reports of possible contamination in the area, old military waste from Cold War operations. Did I know anything about that? Had I noticed any unusual debris, any metal fragments, anything that seemed out of place? His tone was casual, but 2 of his colleagues were already walking the perimeter of the cabin, and I could see one talking into a radio, eyes scanning the tree line. I played dumb, said I'd just been fishing, hadn't seen anything unusual. Carlson nodded, handed me a business card with just a phone number, no agency logo, no address. He said if I remembered anything or found anything unusual, I should call immediately, that some old military materials could be hazardous even after all these years. Then he asked, almost like an afterthought, if I'd taken any photos that day. Maybe for social media. Anything that might help them identify contamination areas. When I said no, he smiled again and said they'd be conducting a survey of the area over the next few days. Suggested it might be safer if I headed back to town until they completed their assessment. It wasn't technically an order, but the way he said it, the way those other 5 people stood around my cabin, I knew I didn't have a choice. I packed up that night, and as I drove out, I saw lights through the trees heading toward the marsh. Lots of them, like a whole operation mobilizing. I kept the items, still have them. Drove straight through to Anchorage that night and put them in a safety deposit box before checking into a motel. The next morning, I called my Uncle Nathan to tell him about the EPA inspection at his property. He went quiet for a long time, then said something that made my blood chill. His brother, the one who disappeared hunting in the 50s, he'd been found 3 weeks after going missing, dead from what they called exposure, but Nathan's father never believed it. The body had strange burns on the hands and face, hair falling out, symptoms the local doctor couldn't explain but told the family not to discuss. The death certificate just said exposure and dehydration. Nathan's father had spent years trying to get answers, writing to the Air Force, to congressmen, to anyone who would listen, always asking about what had happened in January 1950, about what fell from the sky that winter. He'd never gotten a single response, just visits from federal agents telling him to stop asking questions for his family's safety. 2 weeks later, I went back to check the site. The whole marsh area had been excavated down to bedrock, maybe 3 acres completely stripped. Fresh gravel had been trucked in, the ground leveled and compacted like they were preparing for construction. New "no trespassing," environmental remediation area signs were posted every 50 feet, official looking with EPA logos and warning symbols. But here's the thing. I looked up the EPA's contamination database when I got home. There's no record of any cleanup operation at those coordinates. No environmental assessment, no hazardous waste site designation. Nothing. I called the number on Carlson's card once using a payphone at a truck stop. It rang twice, then a voice just said, "Yes?" When I asked for Mr. Carlson, the line went dead. The number was disconnected when I tried again an hour later. I still check online sometimes, searching for any mention of that 1950 flight, cross-referencing the names Morrison and Betty with missing aircraft reports. Every few months, a link I've bookmarked goes dead, a database entry disappears, another piece of the puzzle gets scrubbed away. But I kept those items, and sometimes I pull them out and look at that photograph of Betty and her baby, wondering if they ever knew what really happened, if they're still out there somewhere, getting old now, still waiting for answers about why their father never came home. In January of 1978, I was part of the search team that went looking for old Bill Carver out near the Yukon River Basin. I'd been doing wilderness rescue work for about 6 years by then, mostly pulling lost hunters out of the woods or helping stranded motorists on remote roads. Bill was different, though. He was one of those old-timers who knew the land better than most of us knew our own backyards. When his sister called from Fairbanks saying he hadn't checked in since early November, everyone figured his radio had just crapped out. The guy was pushing 63, but tough as boot leather, been trapping that same stretch of wilderness since before I was born. We gave it another few weeks, thinking he'd show up at the trading post in Circle City, like he always did around Christmas. When he didn't, that's when they called us in. The flight out there took 3 hours in a tiny bush plane, fighting crosswinds the whole way. Bill's cabin sat about 40 miles from the nearest anything you could call civilization, tucked into a bend where Birch Creek feeds into a larger tributary. From the air, the place looked wrong immediately. The roof was caved in on one side under the weight of snow, and there were no tracks leading to or from the cabin. No smoke from the chimney either. The pilot, a guy named Roger who'd been flying these routes since the 50s, kept circling lower and lower, both of us scanning for any sign of movement. The strangest thing was the dogs. Bill always kept 3 or 4 sled dogs, but there was no sign of them. No paw prints, no chain lines in the snow, nothing. Roger set us down on the frozen creek about a quarter mile away, and I remember the silence when he cut the engine. Not even wind. Just that heavy, pressing quiet you only get in deep winter when it's 40 below, and everything living has either left or gone to ground. We had to break trail through about 3 feet of powder to reach the cabin, and it was exhausting work even with snowshoes. The door was partially open, frozen that way, with a drift of snow built up inside the entrance like a miniature glacier. I called out Bill's name several times, but my voice just seemed to get swallowed up by all that white emptiness. Roger stayed back while I squeezed through the doorway, and the first thing that hit me was how organized everything looked. His supplies were stacked neat as you please along the walls. Bags of flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, enough to last him through March easy. The wood stove was cold, had been for weeks judging by the layer of frost coating the iron. His bunk was made up tight with military corners, the wool blankets pulled smooth. Even his tools were laid out on the workbench like he'd just finished cleaning them. The only thing out of place was a chair pulled up to the small table by the window, and on that table was his journal, still open. The journal was one of those thick leather-bound books, the kind they used to sell at the trading posts specifically for trappers to keep records in. Bill's handwriting was small and precise, the cursive loops of someone who'd learned penmanship back when they still taught it proper in schools. Most of the entries were what you'd expect: trap yields, weather observations, notes about animal movements. But starting around mid-November, things got strange. He wrote about wolves, lots of them, more than he'd ever seen in 40 years of working that territory. At first it was just observations. 7 wolves passed the cabin heading north at dawn, or fresh tracks by the woodpile, big male, probably 140 pounds. Then the entries started getting longer, more detailed. He described how they'd circle the cabin at night, not howling, just walking round and round in the snow. He'd counted them by their eyes reflecting his lantern light through the window, sometimes 12, sometimes 15. Once he wrote 23, though he added a question mark like he didn't quite believe it himself. By late November, Bill's entries took on a different tone entirely. He wrote about how the wolves had stopped hunting, stopped moving on like they should. They just stayed, always within sight of the cabin during the day, sitting in the tree line like they were waiting for something. He'd tried firing his rifle over their heads to scare them off, but they didn't even flinch. One entry from November 28th stuck with me because of how he'd pressed the pencil so hard into the paper it nearly tore through. They know I'm alone. Somehow they know. He started rationing his ammunition after that, stopped going out to check his trap lines. The last few entries described how he'd hear them on the roof at night, their claws scraping against the tin as they walked back and forth above his bunk. He'd reinforced the door with extra boards, moved all his food into metal containers. On December 3rd, he wrote that his dogs had gone silent in their shed out back. Not barking, not whining, just quiet. When he looked out the window the next morning, the shed door was open and the dogs were gone. No blood, no signs of struggle, just gone. The final entry was dated December 7th, and it was only 3 lines long. No more firewood inside, have to go to the pile. They're sitting in a perfect circle around the cabin now, about 30 feet out. We'll make the run at noon when the sun's highest. That was it. Nothing after that. I stood there in that freezing cabin reading those words over and over, trying to make sense of it. Roger had come in by then, and he was looking through Bill's supplies, checking dates on canned goods, examining everything with that methodical way he had. Neither of us wanted to say what we were both thinking, that a man like Bill Carver doesn't just walk away from a fully stocked cabin in the middle of an Alaskan winter. We searched the immediate area until dark, found the woodpile he'd mentioned about 50 yards from the cabin, but no tracks, no blood, no sign of Bill. The snow around it was smooth and undisturbed, like it had been falling steady for weeks without anything breaking through. That night we made camp in the cabin, though neither of us slept much. Roger kept the fire going while I went through Bill's things more carefully, looking for anything that might explain what happened. In a wooden crate under his bunk, I found something that made my chest tighten up. Letters he'd been writing to his sister but never sent, dated all through November. In them, he talked about the isolation getting to him, how the darkness was lasting longer each day, how he'd catch himself talking out loud just to hear a human voice. In one letter, he admitted he'd been seeing things in his peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't be there, movement where there was none. He blamed it on the lack of sleep, said the wolves kept him up all night with their pacing. But then he'd crossed out whole paragraphs like he was second-guessing himself, not trusting his own perception anymore. The last letter, dated December 2nd, was just one paragraph. Martha, if something happens to me, know it wasn't the cold or carelessness. This place does things to a man's mind. The wolves aren't acting like wolves anymore. Or maybe I'm not acting like a man. Hard to tell the difference after a while. Around 3 in the morning, Roger shook me awake. He was standing by the window, and when I joined him, I understood why he'd woken me. There were wolves out there, maybe 6 or 7 of them, sitting in the snow just at the edge of where our lamplight reached. They weren't doing anything, just sitting there facing the cabin, their eyes reflecting green in the darkness. We watched them for maybe an hour, neither of us speaking, and they never moved, never made a sound. Then just before dawn, they all stood up at the exact same moment and walked away in single file, disappearing into the trees. Roger turned to me and said the first words either of us had spoken in hours. "We're leaving. Now." We packed up Bill's journal and his personal effects for his sister, left everything else. As the plane lifted off, I looked back and saw them. Had to be 20 or 30 wolves, coming out of the forest and moving toward the cabin. They weren't running or hunting, just walking steady and purposeful, like they were reclaiming something that belonged to them. The official report we filed said Bill Carver likely suffered from cabin fever and wandered off into the wilderness, becoming disoriented and succumbing to the elements. That's what goes on paper when you don't have a body or any evidence of foul play. His sister accepted it, said she'd worried about him being out there alone at his age. But Roger and I, we knew different. Over the next few months, I did some digging, talked to other trappers who'd worked that area over the years. Turns out Bill wasn't the first to disappear from that particular stretch of land. An old Athabascan man in Circle City told me his grandfather used to trap there in the 1920s, but abandoned it after one winter. Said the wolves in that region weren't right, that they remembered things, held grudges maybe. He wouldn't elaborate, just shook his head and changed the subject. I found records of 3 other trappers who'd gone missing in that same area between 1951 and 1969. All of them experienced outdoorsmen. All of them vanished without a trace during winter months. I went back once the following summer with a small team to do a more thorough search. The cabin had completely collapsed by then, just a pile of rotting logs and rusted metal. We found bones scattered around the area, too old to be Bill's, and when we sent them to the university for analysis, they came back as a mix of caribou, moose, and dog remains. But there was one set that the lab couldn't identify, said they were similar to human but not quite right. Like the proportions were off somehow. They wanted to do more tests, but the samples got lost in shipping back to Anchorage, if you can believe that. What really stayed with me, though, was what we found carved into a tree about 100 yards from where the cabin had been. It was old. The bark had grown over it partially, but you could still make out the words. They learn. They wait. They remember. No date, no initials, just those 7 words cut deep into the wood. After that summer search, I never went back to that part of the Yukon Basin, and neither did Roger. He quit flying bush routes altogether about a year later, moved down to Ketchikan to fly tourists around instead. We never talked about what we saw that morning, but I know it changed something in both of us. I still do search and rescue work, but now when someone goes missing in that particular region, I'm always somehow booked up with other assignments. Call it cowardice if you want, but there are places in Alaska that don't belong to us, never have. The old-timers knew it. The indigenous peoples knew it long before that. Bill Carver forgot it, or maybe the isolation made him stop believing it. Every winter when I hear about wolves on the news, regular wolf stuff like livestock attacks or sightings near towns, I think about those ones near Bill's cabin, sitting so still in the snow, waiting with a patience that didn't seem animal at all. The strangest thing happened about 5 years after Bill disappeared. His sister called me out of the blue, said she'd received a package with no return address postmarked from Dawson City. Inside was Bill's wallet, the leather worn smooth, his driver's license and a photo of his sister still tucked inside, along with $17 in cash. Nothing else, no note, no explanation. The wallet hadn't been weather damaged, looked like it had been stored somewhere dry all those years. She asked me what I thought it meant, and I told her I didn't know, which was the truth. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if maybe Bill's still out there somewhere, living by different rules now, running with things that used to be wolves but learned how to be something else. Or maybe the wallet was just some trapper's idea of a kindness, returning what they'd found in the wilderness. I prefer not to think about it too hard. Some questions are better left unasked, and some places are better left alone. That's what I learned that winter of 1978, and it's a lesson I've never forgotten. The research station on San Nicolas Island only had running water for 2 hours each morning, and I'd just finished my cold shower when Dr. Harrison knocked on my door with the news that would change everything. I was 26 that summer in 2001, fresh out of my marine biology PhD program at UC San Diego, working my first real field assignment studying pinniped behavior off the California coast. The island stretched barely 3 miles long, all volcanic rock and stubborn coastal scrub, with a small facility that housed 6 researchers during peak breeding season. We monitored different sea lion colonies scattered around the rocky shores, documenting mating patterns, pup survival rates, and territorial battles between the massive bulls. The work was exhausting but exhilarating, exactly what I'd dreamed about during all those years in windowless labs. Nobody really talked about Dr. Jennifer Lawson, who disappeared the previous year during a routine observation, but her untouched field notebook still sat on the common room shelf like some kind of warning. The official report blamed rough seas and aggressive wildlife, though the details remained frustratingly vague. That particular morning in early July started with an equipment malfunction that should have been my first warning to stay away from Boulder Point. My radio had been crackling with static all night, and when I tried to check in with base camp at 5 a.m., all I got was this weird interference pattern that sounded almost rhythmic, like breathing through a broken speaker. The Western Rookery was my assigned observation post that day. About 300 sea lions packed onto a series of flat rocks that jutted out into the Pacific like broken teeth. Getting there required a 40-minute hike along narrow cliff paths that turned treacherous when wet from the morning fog. I'd made the trek dozens of times already that season, but something felt different as I loaded my gear into my backpack. The bulls had been unusually aggressive lately, with several researchers reporting close calls when the animals had charged much farther inland than typical. One massive bull in particular, tagged as M47, had developed this unnerving habit of following our movements from the water, his scarred head breaking the surface wherever we set up our blinds. He had this damaged left eye, clouded white from some old injury, and the way he'd track us with his good eye while that dead one stared blindly ahead made everyone uncomfortable. Dr. Harrison had asked me to collect tissue samples from any deceased pups I found, a grim but necessary part of understanding mortality patterns in the colony. The preservation kit weighed an extra 15 pounds in my pack, and I remember adjusting the straps repeatedly as I made my way down the volcanic rock trail. The fog was thicker than usual, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet, and the sound of the colony grew louder with each switchback turn. You could hear them before you saw them, this cacophony of deep bellows, high-pitched barks, and the occasional splash as a bull launched himself into the surf. The smell hit next, that distinctive mix of fish, ammonia, and wet fur that seasoned researchers barely noticed anymore but still made newcomers gag. I'd learned to breathe through my mouth on approach, though the taste wasn't much better. As I reached the observation blind, essentially a small wooden structure we'd built behind some larger rocks, I noticed immediately that someone had been there recently. Fresh boot prints in the sand led from the blind down toward the water's edge, which was strange since I had the only scheduled observation that day. The prints were small, maybe a women's size 7, and they had this distinctive wear pattern on the heel that looked familiar. I followed them carefully, staying well clear of the bull's territory markers, invisible boundaries that, if crossed, would trigger an 800-pound charge you couldn't outrun. The tracks led to a flat section of beach where we sometimes found dead pups washed up after storms, but what I found there made me stop breathing for several seconds. Dr. Lawson's equipment bag, the one that had supposedly been lost with her 10 months ago, was wedged between 2 rocks just above the tide line. The canvas was bleached from sun exposure and stiff with salt, but her initials JL were still visible in faded black marker. Inside, her waterproof field notebook had survived remarkably intact, though something had torn deep gouges through the cover, leaving parallel scratches that went clean through 30 pages. The final entry, dated the day she disappeared, contained measurements and behavioral notes that seemed routine until the last paragraph, where her usually neat handwriting became increasingly erratic. M47 displaying unprecedented territorial expansion, she'd written, the letters getting larger and more jagged with each word. Followed me 200+ meters inland. Coordination with other bulls? They're moving in patterns that don't match any documented behavior. Christine saw it too, but Harrison dismisses concerns. The juveniles won't enter the water when M47 is near. They know something. The entry cut off mid-sentence, with a long ink streak trailing off the page like she'd been interrupted while writing. I photographed each page with shaking fingers, trying to document everything before deciding what to do next. The rational part of my brain said to pack up immediately, hike back to base, and show Harrison what I'd found. But those fresh boot prints bothered me. Someone had been here within the last few hours, maybe even this morning, and left without taking this evidence. As I stood there puzzling over the timeline, a sudden silence fell over the colony. If you've never experienced 300 sea lions going completely quiet simultaneously, it's the kind of wrong that makes your primitive brain scream warnings. I turned slowly toward the rookery and saw something that shouldn't have been possible according to everything I'd learned about pinniped behavior. The bulls had formed a semicircle at the water's edge, all facing the same direction, inland, toward where I stood. M47 was in the center, that milky eye catching the morning sun through the fog, and his massive head was lowered in what looked like a hunting posture. The females and pups had retreated to the furthest rocks, pressed together in tight groups, their usual barking replaced by low, anxious rumbles. In 15 years of studying marine mammals, I'd never seen anything remotely similar to this coordinated positioning. My hand moved instinctively to the radio clipped to my belt, but all I got was that same rhythmic static when I tried to call base. The bulls began moving then, not the typical aggressive rushing you'd expect, but this slow, deliberate advance up the beach, maintaining their formation. They covered ground with surprising coordination, using their front flippers to haul their bulk forward while their back flippers provided stability. The preservation kit in my backpack contained a flare gun for emergencies, and I fumbled for it while backing slowly toward the cliff path. Rule number 1 in wildlife research: never run from a predator. But these weren't acting like predators. They moved with the patient inevitability of something that knew its prey had nowhere to go. 30 meters separated us when I fired the flare into the air, the bright red burst momentarily visible through the fog. The sound should have startled them, sent them scrambling back to the water in typical pinniped fashion. Instead, they paused for maybe 3 seconds, then resumed their advance. M47 made this sound I'd never heard from a sea lion before, something between a growl and a clicking that the others seemed to respond to, adjusting their positions slightly. My grandfather had fought in Korea, and he once told me about how the enemy would use psychological tactics, coordinated movements designed to break morale before physical contact. Watching those bulls advance with such unnatural precision reminded me of his stories, except these were animals that shouldn't have been capable of that level of strategic thinking. The cliff path was only 10 meters behind me when I heard the splash. Not the chaotic splashing of animals entering water, but something deliberate and measured. I risked a glance back toward the ocean and saw more bulls emerging from the surf, cutting off any escape route along the beach. They moved to flank the first group, creating what any military tactician would recognize as a pincer movement. That's when I noticed the bones scattered among the rocks near the water's edge, too large to be from fish, too weathered to identify clearly, but arranged in small piles that looked deliberately placed. The fog was lifting slightly, and in the improved visibility, I could see scratch marks on the volcanic rocks leading up from the beach, deep gouges that followed the same paths the bulls were now taking. These weren't random territorial markings. They formed clear routes worn down by repeated use. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of what I was witnessing when I heard human footsteps on the path above me. Relief flooded through me until I saw who it was. Christine Garrett, another researcher who'd supposedly left for the mainland 2 days ago due to a family emergency. Her clothes were filthy, covered in what looked like dried algae and sand, and her hair hung in salt-stiffened clumps around her face. But it was her expression that made my stomach clench, completely blank, like she was sleepwalking with her eyes open. She moved down the path toward me with mechanical precision, her bare feet seemingly unbothered by the sharp volcanic rocks. Behind her, I could hear more footsteps, and within moments, I saw 2 more figures emerging from the fog, Dr. Phillips and Mark Reeves, both researchers who'd been reported missing from other monitoring stations along the California coast over the past 18 months. They all had that same vacant stare, their movements synchronized in a way that matched the bull's formation below. Christine's mouth opened, and she made a sound that wasn't quite human. It was that same clicking growl M47 had produced, except coming from human vocal cords, it sounded broken, wrong. The bulls responded immediately, shifting their formation to create an opening, a clear path that led directly to the water's edge where the bone piles waited. The realization hit me with brutal clarity. Jennifer Lawson hadn't drowned or been killed by aggressive wildlife. She was probably out there somewhere, just like Christine and the others, living in some nightmare existence between human and something else. The preserved tissue samples in my pack suddenly took on a different meaning. Maybe Harrison knew exactly what was happening here and needed proof before anyone would believe it. I scrambled up a steep section of rocks, ignoring how the volcanic surface tore through my pants and left bloody scratches on my palms. The 3 researchers followed with inhuman persistence, never speeding up or slowing down, maintaining that steady, purposeful pace. Above them, I could hear a helicopter approaching. The supply run wasn't scheduled for another week, which meant someone at base had received my flare signal after all. The bulls below began retreating toward the water, their formation dissolving as quickly as it had formed, returning to typical sea lion behavior as if a switch had been flipped. Christine and the others stopped their pursuit, standing perfectly still on the trail, their heads tilted at identical angles as they listened to the approaching aircraft. The helicopter landed on the emergency pad near Boulder Point, and 2 Coast Guard officers jumped out along with Dr. Harrison himself. I ran toward them, waving frantically, trying to form coherent words about what I'd witnessed. But when I turned back to point at Christine and the others, they were gone. No trace of them on the trail, no footprints in the sand, nothing. The bulls had dispersed across the rocks in normal resting positions, looking like any other sea lion colony on any other day. Harrison grabbed my shoulders, his face tight with an expression I couldn't read. "Did you get the samples?" he asked, his voice urgent but controlled. When I nodded, still gasping for breath, he immediately took my backpack and handed it to one of the officers. "We need to evacuate now," he said, guiding me firmly toward the helicopter. "There's been an incident at the mainland facility. Contamination from the lab. We're shutting down all field stations." As the helicopter lifted off, I pressed my face to the window, watching the island shrink below us. For just a moment, I swear I saw them. At least a dozen figures standing waist-deep in the surf, completely still, all facing our departing aircraft. Harrison never let me file an official report about what happened that day. The program was suspended indefinitely, officially due to budgetary constraints following a laboratory contamination event. The tissue samples I'd collected disappeared into some bureaucratic void, and my questions were met with increasingly stern warnings about the NDAs I'd signed. 6 months later, I found a different career path, teaching high school biology in Ohio, about as far from the ocean as I could get. But I kept Dr. Lawson's notebook. I'd hidden it in my personal gear before Harrison could confiscate it. Every few years, I checked the marine biology journals, looking for any mention of unusual pinniped behavior or missing researchers along the Pacific coast. There are patterns if you know what to look for. Stations that close suddenly, researchers who transfer without notice, and always reports of unusually aggressive bull sea lions that witnesses describe as moving with almost human intelligence. The island is still off limits, designated as a protected wildlife sanctuary with no human access allowed. Sometimes I wonder if Christine and the others are still out there, standing in the surf, waiting for the next research team to arrive. The last entry in Lawson's notebook, the one I never showed Harrison, was just 2 words written over and over down an entire page. They learn. The job on the North Slope was never glamorous, but it paid enough to keep me coming back season after season. In the early 80s, life up there was stripped down to the basics. Long stretches of frozen road, modular trailers that rattled with every gust of wind, and a rotating cast of men who tried to stay sane by swapping stories over weak coffee. I'd been assigned to one of the smaller camps, a cluster of metal-sided buildings sitting in the middle of endless white. The work was grueling, but routine. That winter, though, things shifted in a way I still struggle to put into words. It started when 2 guys, Mark Ellison and Dave Rourke, failed to return from a supply run between camps. They weren't strangers to the route. Both had driven it plenty of times. The path was mostly a flat line across ice and snow, with a handful of markers and the occasional pipeline shadow to keep you oriented. When they didn't show up, no one panicked at first. Weather delays weren't unusual. Radios cut out all the time. But after hours stretched into a full day, whispers began curling through the mess hall. The truck was found 2 days later, sunk halfway into a drift not far from the flagged route. What unsettled everyone was what was still inside. Packed crates of food, full thermoses, a heater, extra fuel cans stacked neatly in the back. It looked less like men who got stranded, and more like men who had stepped away for just a minute and never came back. No footprints, no scattered gear, nothing leading away from the vehicle. Just silence, broken only by the constant bite of the wind. The official line spread quickly. Exposure, harsh weather, human error, 2 men who underestimated the cold. But none of us bought it. We knew how careful Mark and Dave were. Dave in particular was meticulous, the kind of guy who labeled every wrench in his kit and double-checked tire chains before anyone else even glanced at them. And Mark had a way of navigating those frozen stretches like he had a compass buried in his gut. Men like that don't just wander into the snow and disappear. Private security had started making its presence known around that time. They weren't company men like us. They had no grease under their nails, no tired eyes from endless shifts. They wore dark parkas without patches and drove spotless trucks that always seemed to be idling near the airstrips. Most of us avoided them. They didn't talk much, and when they did, it wasn't the kind of small talk you could laugh off. It was curt, clipped, like every word was measured. After Mark and Dave vanished, those security guys seemed to multiply overnight. One evening, a mechanic named Joel told me he'd seen Mark and Dave arguing with 2 of the security men near the fuel depot the week before they disappeared. Joel swore he heard raised voices, something about routes not being safe, and you weren't supposed to see that. He said Dave looked furious while Mark kept glancing toward the Snowcat garage like he wanted to bolt. Joel didn't repeat that story to anyone else, at least not openly. Word had a way of getting twisted, and nobody wanted to be the next to draw attention. The search parties went through the motions, snowmobiles combing the flats, helicopters sweeping low, dogs brought in and quickly withdrawn when they kept circling the same patch of frozen ground. Weeks passed and all we got was silence. No bodies, no scraps of clothing, no signal that Mark or Dave had tried to survive out there. The official reports were neat and tidy, stamped and filed away as if the men had been misplaced like paperwork, not swallowed whole by the ice. Still, every night in the rec room, someone would circle back to it. Cigarettes burned down to nubs as the same questions hung in the air. Where could they have gone? And why was security suddenly everywhere? I remember the unease more than anything, the sense that we weren't supposed to ask, that the cold wasn't the only thing pressing down on us. Every time I caught one of those guards staring across the room, it felt like a silent warning to shut my mouth and keep my head down. One night near the end of the season, I walked out behind the generator shack to get a moment of quiet. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and unblinking, and the cold snapped against my face like glass. From there, I could see the long flat where Mark and Dave's truck had been found. For the first time in weeks, I noticed tire tracks that didn't belong to company vehicles. Narrower, fresher than they should have been in that weather. By morning, those tracks were gone, buried under a suspiciously uniform layer of plowed snow. No one mentioned it, but I knew I hadn't imagined what I saw. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense why security never looked worried. They weren't searching for two missing men. They were making sure the rest of us stopped asking questions. I never confronted them, but I learned quickly to avoid certain eyes, to lower my voice when the topic came up. The worst part was the realization that Mark and Dave probably hadn't wandered off at all. Whatever they stumbled onto, someone decided they weren't coming back to camp. When I finally rotated out weeks later, I carried their absence with me like extra weight in my duffel. No memorials, no closure, just 2 names scrubbed from the roster, and a cold note in the logbook. Incident resolved. Exposure. I remember standing at the small airstrip, watching the security trucks parked in a neat line, engines idling in the dark. None of the guards looked at us, but they didn't have to. The message was already clear. Forget it, move on. Even now, decades later, I can still picture their truck half buried in snow, doors shut, supplies untouched. I don't know what Mark and Dave saw that day, but I know it wasn't the storm that took them. And whenever I think about those weeks on the North Slope, it's not the cold or the endless dark that unsettles me. It's the silence that followed, the way 2 men could vanish in plain sight, and everyone else was forced to pretend it was just the weather. I never imagined a quick walk across campus could turn into the kind of memory that still claws at me decades later. At the time, I was a 19-year-old student at a state college in Alaska, living in one of the older dorm buildings. My life was simple: classes during the day, late nights in the library, and the occasional party to break the monotony of long, freezing semesters. The campus wasn't large, just a cluster of brick buildings surrounded by patches of dark spruce trees that always seemed to lean too close to the paths. Nights were especially quiet, and walking alone was something most of us did without thinking twice. That night I had been at a small gathering in an off-campus house where students usually went after midterms. The place was crowded, hot from too many bodies, and the windows fogged over from breath and spilled beer. I remember laughing with a girl from my sociology class while holding a cup of warm soda, when I noticed how late it had gotten. My dorm was less than a 10-minute walk, and the idea of getting some sleep in my own bed sounded better than forcing more conversations. I slipped my coat on, said a quick goodbye, and stepped out into the brittle Alaskan cold. The streets were empty, with snow packed down into uneven ridges by passing cars earlier that evening. The air burned when I breathed, and the sound of my boots crunching against ice was the only rhythm keeping me company. I tried to keep my hands deep in my pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind that carried the smell of wood smoke from nearby houses. Even though it was late, the dorm lights were faintly visible through the skeletal outlines of the trees. It felt like the kind of walk I had done countless times before. Brief, uneventful, nothing to be cautious about. But about halfway there, I noticed something strange lying along the edge of the road. A pair of women's shoes. Not boots, not sneakers, but simple black flats, their surface dusted with snow as if they had been sitting there for a while. They were pointed toward the trees rather than the path, and for some reason, that detail made my breath catch. Nobody would choose to take them off in that kind of cold, not when the ground itself could bite through skin. I stood there staring, the silence around me suddenly stretching too long, like the night itself was waiting for me to react. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone had been drinking too much at the party and ditched them on the way home, but that explanation didn't sit right. The longer I stood there, the more I realized how quiet it had become. No cars, no distant laughter, not even the usual hum from the heating vents on the nearby dorms. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't the only one out there. My eyes kept drifting toward the tree line, where the snow looked darker, like the shadows themselves were shifting. I started walking faster, my breath puffing in short clouds that floated past my face. Every few steps I'd glance back, but the road behind me stretched empty, untouched. Still, there was this nagging certainty that someone was pacing themselves with me, just far enough to stay out of sight. The sound wasn't clear, more like the faint crunch of ice delayed half a second after mine. At one point, I even paused mid-step, and I swear I heard a single echo of snow giving way where I hadn't moved. By the time the dorm came into full view, lit dimly by a buzzing yellow lamp above the entrance, I felt torn between sprinting the last stretch or forcing myself to act normal. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I could almost imagine the warmth of the building wrapping around me if I could just reach the door. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure at the far end of the path. Whoever it was stood still, partly obscured by the trees as if they had been waiting for me to notice. The shape didn't move, didn't wave, didn't step closer, just watched. I told myself not to stop. I fixed my gaze on the dorm entrance and pushed forward, but every step felt like it dragged, like the ground itself wanted to keep me there. My shoulders prickled as though I was under a spotlight, even though the path was swallowed in near darkness. When I finally reached the door and pulled it open, I let the heavy wood slam behind me with a force I hadn't intended. Only then did I risk one last glance through the glass window. The figure was gone, and the shoes by the road remained the only proof that anything had been there at all. The next morning, word spread that campus security had found those same black flats still sitting by the road. Students whispered about them in the cafeteria, speculating about who might have left them there. A girl swore she had seen a tall man hanging around the library that week, always pretending to read but never checking out books. Another mentioned someone had been spotted near the women's dorms late at night, just standing by the lampposts until the lights buzzed out. No one could point to a name, and no one seemed brave enough to report more than rumors. For days after, I avoided walking anywhere alone. Even daylight felt different, like the shadows stretched a little too far, and every door I passed could hide someone waiting. I remember clutching my textbooks against my chest in a way that made my arms ache, as if that extra layer would somehow protect me. The sight of boots, sneakers, any kind of footwear abandoned in the snow would make me shiver. The smallest details, like a car idling too long in the parking lot, suddenly meant something darker. The campus gossip only fueled it, but deep down I knew what I had seen wasn't just imagination. Eventually, police became involved, though they said little publicly. No one was arrested, and no official explanation was ever given about the shoes. Time dulled the sharp edge of fear, but every so often the memory crept back, especially whenever I walked that same stretch of road and glanced toward the tree line. There was always that quiet question in the back of my mind. Did someone follow me that night, waiting for me to make the same mistake someone else had? Or had I narrowly escaped whatever had already happened to another girl? I graduated and left the state, but whenever I hear about unsolved cases from that campus, the image returns. Black flats half buried in snow, and a figure standing too still among the trees. It's been years, and I've built a life far from that dorm, but the fear never really left. I never told anyone in detail what I saw that night, not the way I'm telling it now. Maybe putting it into words is the only way to explain why I still can't walk alone at night without feeling the weight of someone's eyes.